Good morning. And this was really serendipitous. I think it was David who reached out to me and said, we have the Surgeon General here who is here for another purpose, Newsmaker Breakfast. And he was kind enough to lend us a few minutes of his time to share some things that I think all of us will find really interesting. And these things I love, these uh, informal discussions, and this is a room of like-minded individuals. It's Vivek. Let's just make it clear. So the way he pronounces his name is Vivek, right? So the way I remember is Sheikh Vivek. Okay, and we're on a first name basis. So welcome, and I just want to thank you for taking the time. I'm sure you have a very busy schedule here as well. So this is great for all of us.
Well, listen, I'm so glad to be here, and I have the privilege in my job of talking to many different audiences, but my favorite group to talk to are our colleagues, and so to have the chance to be here with all of you, who are folks who are caring for patients each and every day, is it's a real privilege. So I'm very happy to be here.
So a lot of people don't, I think, fully know what the job of the Surgeon General is. It's a coveted position. He has 6,000 people that report to him, and he's our 21st Surgeon General. So it's appointed by the President and for a 4-year term, and then confirmed by the Senate. So 2014 to 2017, and then returned again in 2021 at probably one of the most challenging times in all of our lives after the COVID epidemic. And his focus has some of the main points of his focus back in 2014, if I get it wrong, you'll correct me, were on things like public health matters of trust, obviously, dealing with community outreach, but the e-cigarettes and vaping and things of that nature, which we talked about ahead of time, which I found of particular value, having younger teenagers for whatever reason. It seemed none of them ever smoked, but for whatever, and very few actually drank because of sports. But for some reason or another, they thought that vaping was okay. So I found that to be actually pretty useful information that I used even at home to help educate my own children. One of his biggest, I think, contributing and accomplishments that people recognize him for is his focus on loneliness. I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to read his book called Together. It's a New York Times bestseller. I recently read it and have shared it with at least a half a dozen people, and the people that I've shared it with have thanked me for it. So it's an easy read, and the thing that I found fascinating, the book focuses on the sort of virtual epidemic of loneliness and the importance of togetherness and how it relates directly to our health. It's an evidence-based book that uses stories from different cultures and so forth, and research that I think it's very believable, and it's very readable, and has already had an immediate impact on my own life. And I think it relates directly to the things that we do for player health. As a matter of background, he's an internist, and he can share some of these facts at the Brigham. His wife is also a physician. He has 2 children. He's a huge sports fan and loves basketball and plays racket sports. And he considers himself a mango aficionado, which I thought was really interesting. So I just thought maybe you could share with us a little bit about your path forward and some of the major responsibilities that you have as the nation's top doctor.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for that really kind introduction. And it's just so nice to be with all of you today. Um, I know this is a packed weekend, so I'm glad that we could find some time to be together this morning. We were chatting a little bit earlier, and I was just saying that this is not a job I ever thought I would have. It's not one that I planned for. It's not a job that I even really understood for most of my life. And what happened to me back in 2013, it was now, is one day I actually at that time I was practicing medicine. I was working as a hospitalist. I was teaching residents and medical students. And I was actually building a technology company on the side to try to accelerate research, collaboration. Um, and then I was getting more involved in policy related advocacy because I realized, as many of you have, I'm sure, in your own practice, that while we came to this work generally for idealistic reasons, wanting to help people and reduce suffering, that there were a lot of things that got in the way of that, a lot of bureaucratic obstacles, a lot of processes, regulatory challenges, which often stood between us and the patients we were trying to care for. And I wanted to see what we could do to try to bring fellow clinicians together to try to inform and shape those policies, to have a voice, a seat at the table, if you will, in designing our healthcare system. So I was doing, a bit of all of this, back in 2013, and it was then that I got a call on actually on my birthday, strangely enough, on July 10th, 2013, from a 202 number, and almost didn't pick it up because I was actually my hands were full of my dry cleaning, which I had just picked up at the dry cleaners, and I was walking to my car. But something said to me at one point, "Yeah, just pick it up." So I did, and that happened to be a call from the White House asking me if I would be interested in being considered for this position. What I came to learn later was, and this is during President Obama's administration, was that they were looking to, in many ways, modernize the office of the Surgeon General to think about how do we use new technology to actually impact how this office operates. How do we think about the new threats, new public health issues, uh, as alongside the older ones like tobacco that are currently facing the population? And so that's ultimately how I began down this path. I will tell you that the job of Surgeon General really involves two primary responsibilities. One is a more perhaps publicly known one, which is to share with the public critical information about health, including health crises, so that people can make the right decisions, the right decisions for themselves and their families. Second responsibility, though, is less known, but it has to do with actually why I wear this uniform, which is the second role is to lead the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps. Now, we're all familiar with the Army, with the Navy, with the Air Force. It turns out that in the US government, we actually have 8 uniformed services. And one of them is the Public Health Service, and it consists of around 6,000 officers who are completely dedicated to improving the health of the nation. They include doctors, nurses, physical therapists, pharmacists, public health engineers, a host of clinical and public health specialties. And these officers, who I'm incredibly proud of, they serve in day jobs during, in various federal agencies from CDC to FDA to NIH and others in, almost every zip code in America. But they also are deployed during times of emergency. So when 9/11 happened, for example, we sent many officers to New York City to help care for people who were injured during the terrible attacks. When Ebola hit in 2014 in West Africa, and when there were threats of it spreading to other parts of the world, we deployed hundreds of officers to Liberia to help set up the Monrovia Medical Unit and help care for those who were sick. When hurricanes or tornadoes hit, we deploy our officers to help strengthen the public health infrastructure and deliver clinical care. And during COVID, we deployed thousands of officers to help with everything from vaccination efforts to broader public health surveillance efforts in communities. So that's the second job, sort of or element of the role, and the reason actually why I wear this uniform, because we are part of a uniformed service.
When you think about the two terms that you've had, one starting in 014 and then the current term, what are the biggest differences between those two terms in terms of our public health issues?
Oh, wow, yeah, it feels like night and day, even though it was the same job, because the world was changed dramatically, as so many of us know. One of the things I think is that's really different in terms of what the world looks like and the country looks like is as difficult a place as we were in 2014, 15, 16 in terms of mental health and well-being. We were not in a good place, and we were already in those years struggling with very high rates of depression and anxiety among kids, suicide rates which are heading in the wrong direction. As bad as that was then, it has sadly gotten worse now. And the pandemic had some role to play in this. But there are other factors which we can talk about today that were driving that broader mental health crisis, which have persisted, which haven't been addressed. And so we have seen those rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide, particularly among young people, continue to rise. We've also seen the rates of loneliness and isolation continue to grow. And that's something you talked about just a few minutes ago. But I came to realize actually during my work in office just how profound a health threat loneliness and isolation are. For most of my life, I just thought, well, these are just bad feelings, and we just have to get over them or deal with them in some way. But when I was serving the first time, I began with a listening tour where I was traveling around the country and visiting different communities and really just trying to understand what would be helpful for me to focus on. What do people need? What do they want? And I heard a lot of stories during that time. I was going to like small towns in Alabama. I was going to big cities in the Midwest. I was going all over the country. But these stories of loneliness and isolation kept popping up. People wouldn't use those words, by the way. They would say different things. They would say, I just feel like there's so much that's on my shoulders and I've got to carry it by myself. Or young college students would tell me, there are all these other kids on campus, and but I just don't feel like anybody really knows me for who I am. I feel like I can't be myself. And parents who are incredibly busy, surrounded by other parents, by coworkers, by their kids, family members all the time, would sometimes say that they felt invisible and they felt that they didn't have anyone that they were really connecting with or people who understood them. So I was intrigued and concerned with how commonly this was coming up. And that's what led me down this path to investigate not only how common this was, but how consequential it was for our health. And it's when I realized that when people struggle with being disconnected from one another, it not only increases their risk of anxiety, depression, and suicide, but it also increases their risk over time of physical health ailments. So we're talking like a 29% increase in the risk of cardiovascular disease, and specifically 31% increase in the risk of stroke, 50% increase in the risk of dementia among older people, and a significant impact on premature death, such that if you look at the mortality that's associated with social disconnection, it's actually on par with the mortality that we see with smoking. It's even greater than the mortality we see associated with obesity. And I say that occupying an office that for generations has focused on smoking and obesity as critical public health threats. And what I've come to learn through both stories and science is that loneliness and isolation are public health threats on par with smoking and obesity.
Yeah, in your book, you cite statistics which are pretty staggering. In the 40% range or above, people reporting deep loneliness, lack of connection. It's interesting. We don't think about this probably enough or at all as NBA team physicians. Um, and even the mental health aspect is still something that we struggle with given issues of confidentiality and cross discussions and so forth. I imagine this is a problem even amongst our players. I would say that because of, look, having disposable income and independence is one thing, but the commitment you have towards your sport, they're not normal 18 to 25-year-olds when they're early, younger in their career, isolated in hotel rooms and so forth, and commitments to schedules and travel and lack of sleep and so forth. And it's something that we could even take on as a task if we wanted to, as an association, to start looking at this factor if we can get to the root of it. But what do you think the impact is on our athletes, and what can we do a better job as team physicians and providers?
Well, I'm glad you asked because I actually think that this is a profound challenge for athletes. I've spent a lot of time with athletes over the last 3 years. Some professional athletes, a lot of college athletes as well. And what's really interesting and concerning is that there are many forces which are actually driving them to further loneliness and isolation. And here are some of them. You mentioned actually a number of them, which is if you're traveling all the time, and you're not around family, you're not around friends, it's harder to maintain those ties. Number one. Number two, I think when you have a lot of public recognition or fame, that's a double-edged sword. Everyone wants to be famous, or a lot of young people want to be famous, but once they achieve that, actually it significantly impacts your mental health and well-being if you're not grounded in a set of relationships that you brought to the table before you became famous. You start wondering, are people looking to connect with me just because I'm famous? Do they care about me for who I am, or like what's going on here? And that's a very difficult thing to do. To build relationships after you become famous is really challenging for a lot of people. But there's another element which I think is very pernicious and harmful, and that drives a lot of loneliness and isolation, which is actually social media use. And I've talked to a number of of folks who are players, who have worked closely with players, and over the years, and who have seen this major shift happen over the last 20, 30 years in how players use technology and social media in particular. And one of the real challenges here is on the surface, you might think, well, social media seems great, allows you to connect with people. Isn't that good for loneliness and isolation? Well, not really, as it turns out, because it's the quality of the connections that really matter. And one of the things that happened with the advent of social media is that it shifted our focus from friends to connections, from quality of relationships to quantity of relationships. And people began to focus a lot more on how many followers do I have? How many likes am I getting on Instagram? How many people are reposting my content, watching my videos? And while that has a sort of short-term immediate gratification, for a lot of people it feels hollow at the end of the day, and especially when you encounter folks who are perhaps throwing vitriol at you or criticizing your play, which people do all the time because it's easy to lob accusations and critiques online. That can chip away over time at your sense of self-esteem. It can actually contribute to this feeling of loneliness and isolation. So I worry that for many of our athletes, this has become a profound challenge, right? They may not use the word lonely to talk about it, but the real question is, do you have people in your life who you could go to during a time of crisis? Do you people have people in your life with whom you can be yourself, your authentic self, and not worry about trying to fit some image, public image that you have? And do you have people in your life who you can celebrate and be joyful with, right? These kind of relationships are the ones that matter. And I think historically we've tended to say, yeah, that's up to everyone to kind of figure out themselves. But I think what we have now realized is that if we don't actually help young people in particular to build the social skills, tools, and connections that they need in life, it's not only impactful on their mental health and well being, but it impacts their productivity in the workplace. It impacts how kids perform in school. And we actually know this from good data. Like, from Wharton at the University of Pennsylvania, there's a late professor, Sigal Barsaid, who had done a lot of really interesting research in this space. And full disclosure, she was my old business school professor back in the day. But Barsaid had actually helped to determine that when people struggle with loneliness in the workplace, whether that's a sports team, whether that's a corporate workspace, and when they have a desk job, wherever it might be, that reduces their engagement, it reduces their productivity, it reduces their creativity, and ultimately it impacts their longevity. Right? These are things we should all care about, obviously, in any workplace. So it turns out that however we look at it, helping to foster stronger social connections, helping young people build the skills and tools they need to build healthy relationships, these are just as vital as the physical training we may afford and support young people in as the other supports that we may offer them in their life, because it matters to their health and their performance.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking, and my mind is churning. Is there like an MMPI of loneliness? Is there a survey or a scale that we could give our athletes, and then we could maybe even relate it to player performance? There's a
Yeah.
lot of ways that could go, but as far as just objectively assessing this concept of loneliness or lack of connection, is there anything? Is there
There
any
is.
instrument?
Yeah, that's the good news. Is that there are validated surveys. The probably the most well-known one is the UCLA loneliness questionnaire. There are a few versions of that. There's a 20-question version. There's a 3-question version. Um, and there are a few other validated scales as well. So the bottom line is yes, you can measure this, and it's worth tracking over time. It's one of the things that we're actually encouraging both schools and workplaces to do. I just came off a college tour when I over the last 3 months, where I was visiting various college campuses as part of our broader effort to address loneliness and isolation. This is part of our broader work on mental health. And some of the colleges actually polled their own students about whether they were experiencing loneliness before I came. And I'll tell you, Arizona State University, very large public university, 160,000 plus students. When they polled their students, they found that 80% of them, 80, said that they were struggling with loneliness and isolation. 80%. We went to another large university. They polled their students and they found that 93% of the students who were seeking mental health services on campus noted that loneliness and isolation were one of the top contributing factors to their seeking help that day. So this is incredibly common. When you look at CEOs, you find that nearly half of CEOs are struggling with loneliness across a population 1 in 2 adults. You look at young people, the numbers are actually much higher. Depending on what survey you look at, anywhere from 60 to 70% of adolescents and young adults are struggling with loneliness. So the surveys matter. I think being data-driven people, I think being able to track that over time and see how it connects with performance would be, I think, a very powerful role that many of you could play in your organizations.
I found it interesting. You told me this morning that your book was published in April of 20, right? So just after March pandemic. You would have thought you wrote the book over the course of a month, given what we were in for with the pandemic. So this obviously started way back when. what was the nidus of it? Was it something you recognized in your own life? Was it a singular conversation? Because this is obviously a big platform, and maybe your biggest platform, and probably I would imagine just looking at the data may have the biggest impact on well-being and even longevity. What was the precipitating event?
Well, I had certainly struggled a lot with loneliness in my own life. As a kid, I was pretty shy. I was really introverted, and even though I wanted to make friends, it wasn't so easy. Sometimes um, that was a real struggle in elementary school, in particular. And so, it's funny. The things that happen to us when we're really young in school, sometimes they really stick with us. And I still remember viscerally what it felt like walking into the lunchroom, like in the cafeteria, and just feeling scared as a fourth grader, not knowing if there'd be anyone I could sit next to. I remember being on the playground and worrying if I get picked for a team, even though I was actually pretty athletic and had good ability, but I wasn't as close to a lot of the other kids as they were to each other. And so that feeling, has stayed with me. But as an adult, I also had moments where I experienced loneliness. And this is the thing, I think loneliness is part of the human condition. Like we're all going to experience it at various points. The question is, how deep does it get and how long does it last? Right. And in this respect, I think of it like hunger or thirst. Right. When we feel hunger or thirst, it's because our body is sending us a signal something that we need that's critical for survival is missing. And if we respond by eating or hydrating, then that feeling goes away and we do okay. Similarly with loneliness, if I'm out here on a trip and my two kids, are behind at home and I'm feeling, a little lonely, I'm missing them and I get back to them and reconnect with family, then that feeling may go away. But the challenge is when it persists for a long period of time. And that's what a lot of people are experiencing right now. So for me, it was both a combination of my individual experience, but then hearing these stories across the country and then digging into the science around it and realizing, oh my goodness, this is so much more than I thought, not just in terms of prevalence, but in terms of how consequential it is to our health. And lastly, I'll just say this, just coming back to players for a moment, which is I think that, I mean, you all know because you're on the front lines of helping players through difficult circumstances that what happens to our physical health impacts our mental health and vice versa, right? And I've now spoken to a number of athletes who have been struggling with injuries and who talk about just how much it's impacted their mental health, right? Their sense of self, their confidence, um, and also like when you're injured, you're not around the same group of people, right? That you're normally around, and so that can actually be further isolating if we're not conscious about the mental health impacts, of injury, about the loneliness and isolation that can come with being separated from your teammates and coaching staff, then people can actually start to go down into a downward spiral, and that can ultimately again impact their physical recovery as well. So we have to, I think, look globally at how physical and mental health, impact one another, and care for that. And if you think about the long term, also for a player, think about. I know all of you are, care about the well being of players, not just today, but about what's going to happen to them tomorrow, and what's going to happen, and what are their lives going to be like after their playing days are over. And here too, like for imagine you're a player who's, let's say, been in the league for 15 years and traveled during that time, gone through all kinds of challenges, et cetera, never been able to build a community, and all of a sudden you come out on the other end, no team, no colleagues, and no relationships that you've built and deeply rooted yourself in, no sense of community because you've been traveling, you've been, moving around all this time. That is incredibly difficult. I think it's well known that professional athletes at their post career lives are not always easy. In fact, they're often quite challenging. But one of the most powerful things that you can do to actually help athletes in their current life and in their post playing life is actually to help build that foundation, help them build their foundation for social connection. Because those relationships are the ones that are going to be there for them afterwards. I often think of the relationships as buffers for stress and for adversity. And we all need those buffers in our life. So this is not to say that as team physicians or as team management that your job is to go out and make friends for players. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that being able to have this conversation among players about the power and importance of building our social connections, meaningful social connections in our life, creating the space for players to be able to help each other in this space and talk more openly about it, recognizing we all struggle with it, but we don't talk openly about it. That can do a lot. to help people build the connections that they need, and that will help them now, but also for years to come.
Yeah, I think if I can sort of paraphrase, look, we now have this recognition of its importance. We see that correcting it or changing it or modifying can have a direct impact on player health and maybe even performance. So I think what I'm hearing is we just need to maybe be more intentional in our efforts and help them be more intentional. So obviously going to take a concerted effort, but probably something that we haven't focused on.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And this is a space also where, our office wants to be helpful. I've, Adam Silver and I have known each other for many years. We've talked about this issue a lot. I know Adam cares about mental health broadly, loneliness and isolation, but I'll extend to you what I've extended to Adam, which is just to say that if there are ways that I and our office can help, with these kind of conversations or support you, as you're working on this issue with players, let us know, because part of what we want to do is to get players talking about this more openly with one another. We've already seen, in some cases that Namar and Kevin Love and others have been open and talking about mental health more broadly. Uh, and every time that happens, there are a raft of younger players who take notice of that and say, "Huh, maybe my own struggles aren't something to be ashamed of. Maybe there's a path forward here." Similarly, on this issue of loneliness and isolation, this is part of our mental health and well-being. This is part of what we need to talk about. So we're trying to think about creative ways to work with leagues to do this as well. So happy to engage in whatever way you all think would be helpful.
Thank you. So, just a couple of final questions. What would you say the most satisfying part of your job is? I know you loved being an internist at here at the Brigham, and I'm sure you missed that greatly. I think all of us, the people in this room, have great passion for still taking care of patients, and but you also have a much more dramatic impact on many, many more people now in doing what you do. So, I'm sure that provides great satisfaction. So. What's the most satisfying aspect of your job now?
Well, it's interesting because I'm privileged to be able to do a lot of different things in this job, but the most satisfying part is actually very similar to what was satisfying to me in medicine, which is what I loved in clinical medicine. And I'm not practicing at the moment because I'm not able to in this job, and I miss it every day.
Yeah.
And I often think back on conversations I had with patients, things I learned from patients, and they actually help inform the work that I do in this office. And which is why I just feel so lucky that we get to be clinicians and take care of patients. And I know there's a lot that comes with that that's not easy and that's challenging. But man, isn't it is an incredible like well of treasures and wisdom that I continue to draw from today. I will say that for me in this job, what's most fulfilling is actually being able to go into communities and talk to and listen to people, especially young people. Um, it's both, I think we can all like remember instances where we've had a gratifying conversation with a patient, even though we know they're coming to us in a moment of great pain and suffering, but being able to be a part of their lives in that moment is just sacred. It's extraordinary, and I often think when I go and talk on the road these days and talk to young people, and on a college tour we do this a lot of just being able to sit in a room with them and have them talk to us about what they're feeling, what's going on in their life, what do they hope for, how do they think about success and fulfillment, and what could we do to be helpful. Like these to me feel like I'm right back where I used to be at the Brigham at the bedside. Talking to patients. So that to me will continues to be my greatest source of gratification and learning.
Yeah, you did in your book. You did a great job of borrowing from your experiences with some pretty terrific anecdotes about your working with patients, people who were terminally ill, watching how their families would be in the room, who was interacting, some of the cultural aspects of health and wellness. So it's obvious that you use that as a nidus to create sort of your current platform. So along with all the greatness and satisfaction that comes, what would you say the biggest challenges are of your current job? Maybe even the most dissatisfying aspects.
Well, I'd say that certainly a couple things I'd note. One is one of the challenges is choosing priorities. There are a lot of worthy public health issues. There are a lot of needs, right, that we have out there. People write to us every day with requests, with heartbreaking stories about struggles they and their family are having, asking, can we make this issue a priority? Can we do more on that issue? And knowing that we have very limited resources, it's hard to do, every issue. We can only do a few. And so that's one of the toughest choices we have to make. Uh, I think one of the other challenges that we deal with is that you've all worked in large organizations, and large organizations come with bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Um, Government bureaucracy is a special flavor of bureaucracy, and and sometimes navigating that, times you wonder, you're like, gosh, this time could be a lot better spent, actually directly serving people and hearing from people. But that's part of the tax, if you will. But it's a tax that's well worth navigating because it allows us to work on issues and ultimately, hopefully, have impact at scale.
What's your next big platform? We talked a little bit about. I was asking you offline about the so-called food conspiracy that we have in this country about sugar and added sugar and processed foods and so forth that gets talked about a lot. And I know you've dabbled in obesity and other topics, but what's the next most impactful thing that you think you'll be embarking on if you're able to share?
Oh, well, I'll tell you, and again, the extent to which I'll embark on this is an open question, but if I had a lot more time and resources in addition to mental health, food is the other area that I would be working on. And it's because, look, because of what all of us know. We know that food matters to our health and well-being. And as like obvious as it is now, isn't it somewhat crazy that like 30, 40, 50 years ago that was not necessarily the understanding. And look, when I would train in medical school, I'll tell you the extent of my nutritional education. Our course in nutrition, I remember, was in first year med school. It was an evening course that was offered once a week for 6 weeks, and it was optional, right?
Yeah,
How many people do you think
yeah,
showed up to that course?
yeah, yeah,
I'll tell you, it was six, and I
yeah,
was one of them.
yeah,
I'm not sure I learned a whole lot, though, to be honest with you. And so I think historically in the medical profession, we have paid less attention to nutrition than we perhaps should. All of you, probably have a much greater appreciation, given your work with athletes, for how powerful nutrition is. Here's my big concern. If you look at if you look at the illnesses that we're dealing with in the country, whether it's cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, the list goes down, many of these are being driven in significant part by diet. And I worry that what we have allowed to happen in our country is essentially a denigration of the food supply, of the quality of food that we are offering
yeah.
to people. We actually know this from objective evidence,
Right.
but if you particularly look at highly processed food for a moment, which have been the subject of more recent research studies and more news coverage of those studies, there are more studies that are finding that diets that are high in highly processed foods are associated with adverse physical health outcomes. This is a concern because 2/3 of the diet of kids today
Yeah.
are actually highly processed foods. And around half or a little bit more of the diets of adults are highly processed foods. So this is a no small issue. And the concern that many of the nutritional experts I talked to around the country have around this is that, one, in highly processed foods, there are additives and emulsifiers in these foods and we don't fully understand the impact of these on our microbiome, on our metabolism, on our health. And many of them are not even disclosed, which sounds crazy because you figure, I read the ingredients. Shouldn't they
Right.
be on there?
Right.
If they're below a certain percentage, sometimes they don't have to be disclosed, which is a whole other problem that I think we have to fix. But the other challenge with some of these highly processed foods is you actually, when grind up, process, and break down food, you lose a lot of the cellular structure,
Right.
right? Of food. Actually, is important. It impacts digestion. When you have more rapid metabolism, then you're going to have more uptake in the small bowel, higher, more significant glucose spikes. But you're also delivering less fiber to the large bowel, which we know has its own consequences. But then a lot of the highly processed food is also very high in salt and sugar. And we know that the excess highly refined sugars that we have in our diet are significantly contributing to adverse health outcomes. And finally, just consider this: look, foods like fruits, nuts, etc., they have polyphenols and other compounds in them, which we know are actually beneficial for health, but which often get lost. Again, when you're just essentially putting food together on a component basis, which is how many highly processed, especially high protein, derivative foods are made. And so I have real concerns about what's happened to our food supply. And I also think, look, if you're a food company, I don't think people get into any of these businesses wanting to hurt people. I don't think that's what it is. But if your business model is the more food I sell, the more money I make, then you have an interest in making sure that people eat that food,
Yeah,
right?
creating an addiction, basically.
Right. And so, look, there are food scientists working in companies around the country whose job it is to figure out how do I make sure that Dr. Cole doesn't eat one chip, but two and three and maybe four and then reaches for a fifth, right? And so, there's a lot of like intriguing and very interesting. There's a lot of fascinating from a scientific perspective work that's gone into understanding our brains, our taste buds, and how to get them to sort of get our reward cycle to essentially keep firing, with the right types of food compounds, which then get put into our food. And while that might be fascinating science, as clinicians, like, what we care about is what impact is that having on our health and our well-being. And if you just approach it purely from a data-driven perspective, you'd want to, one, know what's in our food, and two, see the data about how that food impacts our health. And I think the fact that we do not have full visibility into what is in highly processed foods, and that we don't have enough data and studies and money invested in understanding the impact of those foods on our health, despite the fact that it's two-thirds of our kids' diet, to me, that's a travesty from a public health perspective. It's a dereliction of duty from a public health perspective. And I think not just for athletes, but really for everyone. And I've got kids who are 6 and 7. I want what every parent wants, which is I want them to grow up to be healthy and strong. What I feed them actually matters, right? To that end. So if we can equip parents and educators and trainers and people across the board with the information and tools they need to understand what different types of food do to their bodies, I think it would do a lot for their health. We are spending trillions of dollars treating diseases that are being fueled by a diet and by a food system that we have in fact subsidized. Like, that doesn't make sense, right? Like, we should be doing the opposite. We should, if anything, we should be understanding what promotes health. We should be investing in that if we're going to provide subsidies for raw ingredients in food, and we should be helping people get that information so that they can live longer and healthier lives, and so that the demand on the healthcare system is ultimately reduced.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at type 2 diabetes didn't exist or barely existed even when I was younger. We didn't have peanut allergies. We didn't have insensitive to gluten. There is a ton of data. And I would think one of the greatest things about your job is that, we all as physicians can affect one person at a time where you can just affect the masses. So I don't know if you're looking for another book idea or already have this idea, but this to me would be something that would have an amazing impact on the world. There's so many cultural differences. Recently traveled to Japan, and all you have to do is look around. And I think that one of the key factors, if you look at the literature that supports it, is this concept of food processing, and it's just a completely different profile of individuals in various parts of this world that we don't have in the United States. So I hope that's something that you hit with great fervor, because you'll have an amazing impact as people listen to you. Any final comments, to those in the room, largely filled with NBA physicians? Words of wisdom, things you can tell us to do our jobs better as it relates to player health.
Well, I don't know that I have any words of wisdom to share per se, but a couple things I'd say. One is just a thank you to all of you for not just today, but really for the work you're doing each and every day to take care of patients and players. Um, you're encountering people at such an important part of their lives, and it's not just those people, but it's all the folks that they have an influence on, people who look up to them, people who they inspire, and being able to take care of them, making sure that they can show up as their best selves physically and mentally, is a real contribution. It's an important service. And so I don't even know like 2% of all the challenges that you encounter in your day-to-day job, all the difficulties and obstacles that you've got to jump over. But I appreciate you for what you're doing. I also just want to say more broadly, as I think about our country and where we are right now, I one of my great worries, and I'm sharing this with you both to share, but also because I think we can all do something about this. One of my great worries is I think there's this sense of despair that sort of descended, upon people and communities across America. I sense that, I hear that very clearly, and we say on the one hand, some of that is because of difficult things like happening in the country and around the world, right? There are major global conflicts happening. There are people dealing with economic uncertainty. There are folks who are contending with violence in their communities, every day, who are dealing with the trauma of that. There's a lot of challenging things happening. Young people talk to me all the time about their worry about what the future will look like with regard to climate change. There are a lot of worries, a lot of good reasons for people to be concerned. But I worry that there's something deeper happening internally that's actually affecting our own inner strength, our sense of peace and fulfillment and resilience. And I think that has to do in part with the fact that we have become more disconnected from one another and have lost one of our most powerful sources of resilience and one of our important buffers for strength, for adversity. But I also think that there's some other things going on here too. I think that many people are looking for a sense of purpose and meaning. And when I travel to colleges and high schools around the country and I hear young people, and I ask young people all the time, how do you define success? What are you looking for if you want to lead a fulfilling life? What do you think is going to make that possible? The things that they often say back to me, not because they believe this is what they want to follow, but because they believe this is what society is telling them success is, are money, power, and fame. Those are the things they talk about, right? Yeah, just yesterday I was listening to a talk given by yeah, a very well-known and successful actor who knows lots of folks who have won an Oscar. And he was saying that one of the loneliest nights in their lives are the lives that they win that, the nights that they win that Oscar, and they go back to their hotel room, and they're all alone. They've reached the mountaintop from all of our perspectives, and they ask themselves, "Is this all there is? Isn't there something more?" There's nothing wrong with being famous, nothing wrong with being powerful, nothing wrong with being rich, nothing wrong at all with any of that. But the challenge is if we're telling our kids that that is the path to success, that that's a recipe for fulfillment, then we are guaranteeing that they will be disappointed at some point down the line. So how we anchor our kids and young adults in strong community and connection, in a sense of meaning and purpose that extends beyond themselves, how we engage them in acts of service and caring, recognizing that there's more and more data that tells us when we help other people, we feel better. It actually improves our own cardiovascular outcomes over time. Service is good for our health. How do we build a life and a foundation for life for young people where service, where purpose, where community and connection are at the heart of how they define success, of what they seek to invest and build in their lives? That is a fundamental question that will determine whether we continue down a path of despair or whether we reclaim our place as optimists, as people who are fulfilled, who, despite the challenges that we may face, have the faith and belief in ourselves and in each other that we can summon what's required to respond. And so we're at this fork in the road. And it's not that we don't have to address the external things. We do, and we can, and we should. But if we don't also simultaneously work on building people up from the inside, starting at young ages, then we won't want what every parent wants, which is, we won't have, I should say, what every parent wants, which is to see their kids grow up fulfilled, to thrive, to be healthy physically and mentally, and to ultimately contribute to society in positive ways. So I share this only because the more I've done this job, the more I've tried to ask myself this question: what is driving that deeper despair? I've come to believe that this is what is at the heart of it. This is what we have to address. And we can each start doing this in our own lives. I think about the work you do with players, right? Imagine if, in addition to working with them on the piece we talked about, building connection, imagine if we built in opportunities for them to serve, thinking about the NBA Cares model, expanding that further, we build that into their way of life, into their way of thinking. Imagine if we work with, as coaches, with players on what is their broader sense of purpose and meaning beyond the number of chips that you win, beyond the number of followers that you get on social, beyond your, getting great contracts and having great salary. What is the bigger purpose and meaning that they want in their life that could help fulfill them? This is how we help people build a compass that will help guide them for the rest of their lives. And we can all play a role in doing that at home, at work, and hopefully in society at large. So just wonderful to be with you today. Thank you so much for this conversation.
You're welcome. Yeah, I just say I'm very, you know, we're all grateful that you decided to pick up the phone from a 202 area code, and it seems like 2 presidents and 2 senates got it right. You're our guy. You're our top doctor. Thank you very much.